Hey viewers, blood, gore, dismemberment, they're all things I can't show you for another few seconds, thanks YouTube, but I'm sure you know their implementation in Fallout New Vegas is extremely lackluster. Blood in FNV is represented by pathetically low resolution 256 by 256 textures. Enough time has passed so now I can show you. Just look at it. Shameful is what it is. Another problem is each NPC can only have 3 wound decals on them at once, and they disappear after a short few seconds, and they don't appear on heads, at least for human enemies. Super mutants and feral ghouls have working head wounds, but still only 3, and they fade away fast. Many outfits don't support wound decals at all because Obsidian screwed up while making them. And of course, it's ridiculous that you can cleanly decapitate someone with a 9mm pistol as if you sliced their head off with a sword. It's plain as day that this game's gore system is a bloody mess, and not the good kind. We need mods to upgrade the blood and gore to the standard it should have always been at, and I have plenty of mods to cover. 16, in fact. For many of them I have very little to say, since they're just retextures and it's up to your personal preference whether they look good or not, but even with such simple mods there can be problems, as we shall see. But before looking at any mods, I'm going to show off some any tweaks that will help the decal situation. Just copy the tweaks from the description of this video into Falloutcustom.ini and you'll be able to have up to 50 wounds on each NPC, and they'll last for 12 minutes, long enough to almost never see them disappear. If you really want, you can increase these numbers even more. Sadly, none of these tweaks allow wound decals to appear on NPC heads. There are mods for Fallout 4 and Starfield to enable head wounds, but sadly this doesn't seem to be possible in New Vegas, or else someone would have done it by now. Still, these tweaks go a long way to help make the mess stay put, and make FNV a gorier game. Also, in Stewie Tweaks, which you're almost certainly already using, you can enable the tweak Bloody Mess Gibbs Targeted Limb Only, which prevents NPC torsos from exploding randomly when you shoot them in the limbs if you have the Bloody Mess perk. I still don't like Bloody Mess, but it's a lot more tolerable with this tweak on. With all that useful information out of the way, let's finally get back to the mods. Like I said before, I'm reviewing 16 of them, and they're listed on screen right now. I've certainly forgotten or didn't want to bother with several mods related to blood and gore, such as Eve, which has new blood spurts, but also has so many other features and incompatibilities I don't have time to get into them. I'm also pretty sure somewhere out there there's a backport of Fallout 4's Gibbs into Fallout New Vegas, but that's on Gun Network or somebody's Discord, and I don't want to go looking for that shit. I stuck to mods that are on the Nexus. We're 3 minutes in already, jeez. Okay, here's the mods I'd recommend. I would definitely use Skinned Mesh Improvement Mod, Dismemberment Tweaks, and Enhanced Blood Textures. Enhanced Blood Textures as optional plugins are down to personal taste. I myself use the Smaller Wounds, Smaller Splatters Default, Reduced Ragdoll Force, Reduced Dismember Force, and No Screen Blood plugins, but you can play around and enable the ones you like. Only the More Gore plugin presents any serious compatibility concerns. You might also want to use the Headshot Splatter mod if you have a good PC and don't notice any micro-stuttering, but on a bigger load order, I'd be careful since many people report crashes when using it in combination with face mods like Character Kit Remake. The rest of the mods I'm reviewing range from good but not good enough to recommend, down to ones I absolutely do not recommend because they make the game stutter like crazy. You'll have to keep watching to find out which are which. Time to step into this mess. First up, we've got Skinned Mesh Improvement Mod, a vital mod for fixing many problems with armor and creature meshes, but what's important for our purposes today is it makes some outfits that previously couldn't show wound decals allow them. Not every outfit is fixed, but it's a big improvement. This mod is an absolute no-brainer. Second, we've got a relatively new mod called Headshot Splatter, which I can only tentatively recommend. The mod has 2 features. One, if a human or non-feral ghoul is killed by a hit to the head, a bullet hole decal will be placed on their forehead and blood surrounding that. This feature works well. Sometimes the bullet hole gets cut off a little, but generally it looks good, especially from a reasonable distance. These bullet wounds can rarely also appear from melee attacks, but you can easily say you just stabbed or bludgeoned a hole into their head. It's not a big deal. The other feature affects pretty much all NPCs and creatures. If their heads are decapitated or destroyed, a blood splatter overlay covers their entire bodies after a few seconds. For robots, the effect is black, and it looks like they're covered in oil. Mirelurks and Zatans erroneously have a red blood overlay when their blood should be green, but you won't be encountering many of them in New Vegas. This is mostly a concern for Tale of Two Wastelands users, and a minor one at that. A bigger concern could be the small amount of micro stutter that happens the first few times this mod's effects happen. I get a few milliseconds of frame time variation, which isn't noticeable to my eyes. I can only see it on a frame time graph, and I need to be playing above 60 FPS to even get the micro stutter, but lower end systems may experience longer pauses. There's also a lot of crash reports in this mod's Nexus comments. I didn't have any crashes in my short time using it so far, but just keep in mind if you use face-altering mods, they could possibly be incompatible. Third, we've got an incredible little mod called Dismemberment Tweaks. Over the years, there's been plenty of mods which manually edit weapon records to change their dismemberment possibilities, but there's zero reason to use any of those anymore when Dismemberment Tweaks exists. Out of the box, it will prevent any firearm from any mod from cleanly dismembering limbs. They'll only destroy them now. You can further configure weapons by adding their editor IDs to the INI if you want, but this behavior makes sense for most guns. By default, low-caliber weapons like the 9mm pistol are configured to not shoot off limbs at all. Blunt weapons like sledgehammers will only destroy limbs, while bladed weapons will only sever them. With this mod, finally New Vegas' dismemberment makes sense, and because it doesn't manually edit weapon records, there's no compatibility issues to worry about. There's another very similar mod called Gore Dismember and Explode Edits LE, but it doesn't work with all weapons automatically. You have to add new ones by their editor ID, so it's harder to set up than Dismemberment Tweaks. Fourth, we've got an old but gold mod, Enhanced Blood Textures. It hasn't been updated in 10 years, but somehow it's still the best blood mod I could find. It upgrades New Vegas' blood textures to 1K, that's 4 times the size of vanilla, 16 times the detail. And unlike most other retextures, this mod comes with several plugins to customize the experience. The base plugin edits impact data to add claw and blade wounds. In vanilla, all weapons except energy weapons leave a generic red mark, but with EBT, there's separate texture sets for bullet holes, blade slashes, claw marks, and blunt force trauma. The base plugin also greatly increases the size of blood splatters and wound decals, which is a questionable choice because it stretches their quality thin and harms realism. Game settings are edited to make the screen blood when you get shot disappear faster. It takes about 5 seconds versus 20 seconds in vanilla. However, since the textures for screen blood have been modified, despite fading away faster, the bloody screen is now much more intrusive than before. You can see a lot of bright white flashes on the bodies in this footage, which is caused by New Vegas' HDR effect in combination with MSAA. Vanilla blood decals cause this graphical error too, but it's more visible with enhanced blood textures as larger decals. I've disabled MSAA for the remainder of this video to hide this distracting problem. EBT's optional plugins are useful, but somewhat confusingly named. They need to be loaded below the main plugin to overwrite it, since they contain a lot of the same records. Full screen blood instant remove doesn't actually remove the screen blood instantly, just in about 1 second, 5 times as fast as normal. Screen blood can still be very disruptive to gameplay. Less screen blood time makes it last about 2 seconds, so it's an intermediate option in between the previous plugin and the base plugin. The More Gore plugin edits body part data to spawn more gibs when limbs explode. These extra gibs are generic and don't even look like they fit inside the body parts that have been gibbed. This plugin also tries to spawn more decals when limbs are severed or exploded, but I don't think it works because the game always avoids placing decals on top of each other. Also, because this plugin edits body part data, it's not compatible with many popular mods like Realistic Weapon Damages or Bleed. It should be relatively easy to resolve any conflicts in Xedit, however. The No Screen Blood plugin just makes the screen blood not appear, period. And this is the option I use, since no, I don't like the sight of my own blood. Reduced Dismember Force edits explosion data to make gibs not fly as far away after being shot off. This makes them tend to land closer together and closer to the blood on the ground, which in my view looks better and feels more realistic. I don't know any other mods that edit the same explosions as this plugin, so it should be compatible with anything. Reduced Ragdoll Force edits game settings to greatly reduce the amount of physics impulse imparted on bodies when they are killed. Each weapon has its own kill impulse, so shotguns and sniper rifles will still push corpses back, just not nearly as far as before. I think this is an excellent change, and since it's done through game settings, it should work with whatever custom skeleton you're using. The Screen Blood Vanilla perk is poorly named. A casual user might imagine it restores the vanilla game's Screen Blood effects, but instead it restores the vanilla settings for Screen Blood, making it last an absurd 20 seconds. Those who want the raspberry jam on their screen removed will get a nasty surprise using this plugin unless they delete EBT's Screen Blood textures first. The smaller Splatter's default plugin reduces the size of ground blood decals to approximately their vanilla size. I use this plugin because the basic splatters are just too big. The smaller Splatter's realistic plugin makes them even smaller than vanilla. One would think with the more Gore plugin you could get a lot of small splatters, which might look good, but sadly no, the amount of blood is very underwhelming. I think this plugin goes too far in the opposite direction as the base plugin and makes blood splatters too small. Finally, the smaller Wounds plugin makes wound decals on bodies much smaller, even smaller than vanilla. This looks realistic and sensible in my eyes. If anything, wounds should be smaller still. I wish there was another plugin. I also wish there could be exit wounds on the opposite sides of bodies, but what we have now is acceptable. It's not quite Soldier of Fortune 2, but it's alright. Knife and claw cuts are still huge and gruesome with this plugin, which is good. If you just get EBT and the first 3 mods I've listed, you can really improve New Vegas' Gore. You could stop right here, but we're not gonna stop. Fifth, we have a very promising but ultimately disappointing mod, Blood Decal Overhaul. BDO has the incredible idea of placing different decals on bodies depending on the caliber of the weapon that hits them. So 22 caliber bullets will leave very small holes in bodies compared to 10mm, shotguns leave a pellet-like pattern, and 50 cal bullets leave a huge smear. This is accomplished via scripts, and at first glance, seems to work well. Any weapon that uses a vanilla ammo type will automatically be compatible with this mod, since impacted datasets are changed on the fly whenever a weapon is fired using an event handler. There's some minor issues. Shotgun slugs still leave multiple holes because specific ammo types aren't accounted for, only entire ammo form lists. Additionally, it's not patched for Tale of Two Wastelands, so 32 caliber weapons will continue to use vanilla decals, and so will any weapons using modded calibers. Unlike enhanced blood textures, there's no special decals for knives or claws. They'll use vanilla decals too. You can of course load BDO after EBT to get their decals working alongside each other. The real problem with this mod, though, is the micro-stutter that happens the first few times weapons fire or bullets hit targets. The micro-stuttering is much more severe than headshot splatters, since even with a 60 FPS cap, there can still be drops below that on my system. I tried to fix the stuttering by packing the mod's textures into a BSA, but that didn't help one bit. It must be scripts causing the stuttering rather than textures. Perhaps an update to JIP LN could help, I don't know. Anyhow, BDO has another feature, called Absorption, separated into 3 additional plugins. Basically, if over 70% of a bullet's damage is blocked by a target's armor, the wound decal will be changed to a more metallic one, and the blood particles spawning from the body will be swapped for dusty ones. It's a good idea, but it causes even more stuttering, and many armors have exposed legs, arms, or even parts of the chest. Seeing a metallic decal on human skin looks bad. It also looks bad on creatures with high DT, like Deathclaws. The feature breaks if you have localized DT/DR enabled in JIP LN settings. It will work only on creatures in this case. It took me an hour or 2 to figure that out. I was wondering why it wasn't working. Anyways, to fix the exposed skin problem, there's 2 more plugins that add form lists of armors featuring exposed arms and legs. The first plugin is for vanilla armor, and the second is for Tale of Two Wastelands. If an armor is placed in the right form list, the metal decal won't spawn. Sadly, the Tale of Two Wastelands plugin contains dirty edits for a lot of world spaces, which is bad because it reverts their climate and water records to what I assume are those from the earlier versions of TTW. I can't think of any legitimate reason for these edits to be in the plugin, so they must be mistakes. I would also highly recommend against using the Falloutcustom.ini provided by this mod, since it contains performance tweaks I'm not sure are safe. They aren't in the Viva New Vegas or Best of Times guide, so I don't trust them. Add the settings from my description instead, and if they're not extreme enough for you, you can tweak them upward. Anyways, long story short, this mod is a great idea, and the results can look excellent, but it's just not playable for me. Maybe it could be fixed by future updates. Sixth, we've got Gore Overhaul, a remodel and retexture of New Vegas' Gibbs with 2K textures. The new Gore is a lot brighter than vanilla. The textures look a lot more detailed, but their color just doesn't match enhanced blood textures, which is my go-to. It might pair well with some of the brighter blood retextures I'll showcase later. I detected no performance loss or stuttering when using this mod, even with lots of Gore spawning in on a freshly loaded save. However, the Nexus comments are full of people reporting stuttering or even crashes due to broken meshes. Apparently New Vegas Anti-Crash can suppress these crashes, but I wouldn't take the risk. I'd say this mod is best avoided unless it gets an update. Seventh, we have FO4 Enhanced Blood Textures for FNV. which backports some textures from Fallout 4's version of enhanced blood textures into Fallout New Vegas. Most of this mod's textures are 2K, and you can use them to replace the regular EBT's 1K textures if you prefer. I'd say they look good and match up with EBT quite well. Note, however, that this mod only covers blood splatters on the ground and blood on the screen. It doesn't cover skin decals or gore. Personally, I could see myself using the blood splatters, but I would ditch the screen blood because it covers the entire screen and looks very distracting. But some might love it, it's all subjective. And there's nothing else to say about this mod. It doesn't have a plugin, and there's no serious performance considerations. 8th, we have Alternative Blood Spout, a very old mod, and the only one I could find that edits blood particles besides Eve. I don't like the look of these alternative blood spouts. They seem the same resolution or lower than Vanilla's, and they accentuate the unfortunate fact that the blood spray when NPCs are shot doesn't line up in any way with the blood decals that end up on the ground. There's two versions of this mod. One is a compatibility version that works with enhanced blood textures, but sadly it will overwrite the smaller wounds plugin, making the wounds huge again unless you merge some values in FNVEdit. Ultimately, it's a matter of personal taste whether you like this mod. I hate how it looks, but you might love it, and it doesn't hurt performance and only has minor compatibility problems, so I can't say it's bad. 9th, we've got ETJ Realistic Enhanced Blood Textures, a mod claiming to be a successor to Enhanced Blood Textures. It comes in two versions, both containing the same 1K textures, which technically are no more detailed than Enhanced Blood Textures. The only difference between the two versions are the size of the blood splatters on the ground. The Strings of New Vegas version has bigger decals, Melancholy makes them smaller. The blood is very dark, and it does look like strings, I guess. I kind of like the look of it. Like the original EBT, there's separate decals for knife, claw, and blunt weapon wounds, which does give this mod a leg up over the competition, and you could probably use some of EBT's optional plugins to customize your experience. Unfortunately, one little problem ruins everything: stutter. Every time a blood decal spawns for the first time after loading a save or fast traveling, I get a 90 to 100 millisecond stutter, which is absolutely unacceptable. The reason is these decals don't have MIP maps. Generating MIP maps yourself in Photoshop or GIMP will fix the stuttering, and packing the textures inside a BSA will help even more. If you're not willing to do that, avoid this mod. 10th, we've got Black Ops Cold War Blood Splatter Decal, bringing blood textures ported from 2020's Call of Duty into 2010's New Vegas. The mod comes in 2K and 1K versions, and it doesn't have any plugins. Like mod number 7, it only covers blood splatter on the ground and walls. It doesn't touch gore or wound decals. I like the textures, they're the right color to match up with EBT. There's a good amount of variation. One of the patterns is smeary, another has a lot of droplets. I'd say it's an okay option for use alongside EBT, and there's no performance problems, it runs perfectly on my end. 11th, we've got Brutal Splatter Blood Enhancement. It has 6 versions, and I had the unenviable task of testing them all. Strangely, even though this is purely a texture mod, meaning there's no plugin file to add new types of wound decals, textures have been added for knife and claw wounds, but they'll go unused unless you load this mod with enhanced blood textures. Anyways, there's Type 1 and Type 2 blood, each having a reduced version. Type 1 blood is a bit brighter than vanilla and doesn't quite match up with the decals on NPC corpses. The reduced version isn't reduced by much, since there's no plugin to actually make the decal smaller, it's just been shrunk on the texture sheet itself. Type 2 blood is a little brighter still, and there's different splatter patterns. Again, the reduced version is very similar to the regular version. As for the Misty and Messy versions of the mod, I can't really tell much difference between them. I didn't have time at this point to look for more than a few minutes. All versions have 512 by 512 textures, so they might be a good option for low-end systems, being only slightly bigger than vanilla textures. I wouldn't use this mod, but it's not a terrible choice. 12th, by the same author, is Classic Gore, or Classic Blood and Gore if you go by the file name. Whatever you want to call it, it's another basic retexture covering ground decals and gore bits, but not wounds on characters. This is a very bright retexture, so it doesn't look good with vanilla wound decals. This one has a reduced version too, and again, the textures have just been slightly shrunk on the sheet. Like the last mod, it's 512 by 512, so it's a good performance choice, but I don't have much to say about it. 13th, with no end in sight, we've got Bloodverhaul Blood Texture. This is yet another retexture mod, and like Classic Gore, it's very saturated and bright. I like this one better since the decal patterns are more varied, and it's got 2K textures instead of 512 by 512. Just like most blood retextures, there's no coverage of wound decals, so they'll look too dark compared to the blood on the ground. If you don't care about that, here's one more texture pack you can use if you like the look of it. 14th, we have Vanilla Blood Textures Remastered, another pure retexture mod, this one keeping the basic outline of the vanilla game's bloodstains, but greatly improving their resolution. It installs as a foam mod where you can select dark and bright versions of the textures at 1K, 2K, or even 4K. Well, the dark 4K version makes the game freeze for 3 whole seconds the first time blood spawns, which made me laugh my ass off. The 2K version only adds a little bit of frame time variance. I didn't bother BSA packing the textures, but I imagine that would help make them load faster. Just like the last 4 mods, wound decals aren't covered, only ground splatters are, and I have zero nostalgia for the vanilla blood texture patterns, so I'd pretty much rather use anything else besides this mod. 15th, we actually have something exciting, a brand new mod called Blood Trails ESPless. This is an extremely interesting mod, which by default spawns blood decals under NPCs every few seconds when their health is below 50%. It can interact with other mods, such as Bleed, to spawn decals when their bleeding effects are active as well, but I didn't have time to test that. The spawning of decals is tied to frame rate, so with my regular 160 FPS target, the trails are very thick and overlap like crazy, but with a 30 FPS target, this isn't the case. Thankfully, the spawn rate is configurable with the invoke every frames parameter. Increasing it will reduce the frequency of decals being spawned. There also seems to be some sort of function that stops decals from spawning right on top of each other when NPCs are stationary, which is for the best since too many overlapping decals can cause horrible Z-fighting. In addition to adjusting the spawn rate, if you're not using a bleed out mod, I'd recommend lowering the threshold for bleeding to something well below 50% health unless you want tons of blood decals everywhere, which would be awesome if the decals didn't tend to float above uneven ground. Unless you're doing your killing in a flat area, all the floating blood can be very distracting. Also, sadly, none of the retexture mods I've covered today contain the textures this particular mod uses to spawn its decals, so they'll look vanilla and low resolution compared to EBT or anything higher resolution. Still, this is an interesting mod and one to watch over the next few weeks and months. It just came out, and it's still getting updates, so there's room for textures to be improved, and maybe the floating decals can be fixed too. I'll be waiting with bated breath. Last, but certainly not least, we've got Juicier Gore sounds. All this one does is replace the sounds when you sever limbs with ones that are longer, louder, and meatier. I don't have any problem with the vanilla gore sounds, so it's unneeded as far as I'm concerned, but if you love these new sounds, all power to you. There's no downside to using this mod. Okay, that was everything I had time to look at. I hope you found this video at least somewhat useful, if not enjoyable. I really need to get to sleep. Until next time, toodles!